Welcome to Medscape. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner, and my guest today is Dr. Jose Merino. Dr. Merino is editor-in-chief of the Neurology family of journals, professor of neurology, and co-vice chair of education at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Our program today is a follow-up of Dr. Merino's presentation at the recent American Academy of Neurology meeting in Denver, Colorado. Along with two other panelists, Dr. Merino discussed the role of open access publication and the dangers of predatory journals. Dr. Merino, welcome to Medscape.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
You know, I remember when publication in neurology was pretty straightforward. It was either the green journal or the blue journal, but things have certainly changed. I think one topic that is not clear to everyone is this concept of open access. Could you define that for us?
Sure. Open access is a mode of publication that fosters some more open science or accessible science. And the idea of open access is that it combines two main elements. One is that the papers that are published become immediately available to anybody with an internet connection anywhere in the world without any restrictions. But the second important element from open access, which makes it different from other models we can talk about, is the fact that the authors retain the copyright of their work, but they give the journal and readers a license to use, reproduce, modify the content. Now, this is different, for example, from instances where we have funders mandates. For example, NIH papers have to become available 6 months later, so they're available to everybody, but not immediately. And then the copyright is retained by, in the case of NIH employees, for example, by the government or by the journals themselves. So the two elements of open access, I think, is immediate access to the material and the fact that it's published with a Creative Commons license.
I remember that when a journal article was published, say in neurology, if you didn't have a subscription to neurology, you went to the library, who hopefully had a subscription to neurology. And if they didn't have it, you would write to the author and say, hey, I heard you have this great paper because the abstract was out there. Could you send me a reprint? Right. Now, has that whole kind of universe evaporated?
It depends on how the paper is published. So for example, in neurology, some of the research we publish is open access. Basically, if you have an internet connection, you can access the paper. That's the case for papers published in our wholly open access journals in the neurology family, like neurology, immunology, and neuroinflammation, or neurology genetics, or neurology education. For other papers that are published in neurology not under open access, there is a paywall. For some of them, the paywall comes down after a few months, based on funded mandates and so on. As I was mentioning, NIH-funded papers get available 6 months later. So again, in the first 6 months, you may have to go to your library, and if your library has a subscription, you can download it directly. Or there are those that always stay behind the paywall, where you have to have a subscription, or your library has to have a subscription.
I'm a professional writer, and with any luck, when I write something, I get paid to write it. But there's been a long tradition in academic medicine that when you submit an article to, say, neurology, you don't get paid as an author for the publication. Your reward is the honor of it being published. And neurology supports itself in various ways, including advertising and so on. So that's been the sort of contract. Free publication for work that merits it, and the journal survives on its own. Now, with open access, one of the things that's happened is that, and I've published open access myself, is that I get a notification that I need to pay to have my article that I've slaved over published. So explain that, please.
So this is the issue with open access I mentioned. The paper gets published. You're giving the journal a license to publish it. You're retaining the copyright of your work. So that means that the journal cannot make money or support itself by just publishing open access, because they belong to you. And typically, these open access journals are not in print, don't have much in terms of advertising. So that's the contract is you're giving me a license to publish it, but it's your journal, so you're paying a fee for the journal expenses to basically produce your paper. So that's what's happening with open access. Now, that's been recognized with a lot of funders. So, for example, NIH funding or a lot of the European funders, they're including open access fees as part of their funding for research. Now, of course, this doesn't help if you're not a funded researcher or if you're a fellow who's doing work and so on. And typically, most journals will have some sort of waived fees or lower fees for this kind of situations. But the reason for the open access fee is the fact that you're retaining the copyright. So you're not giving it to the journal who can then use it to generate its revenue for supporting itself and editorial staff and so on.
Now, this idea of charging for publication has created kind of a satellite business of the what's called predatory journals. How does one know if the open access journal that I'm submitting to is really just in the business of they just want my $300 or my $900 to get published? How do I know if that's sort of a reasonable place to publish?
So that's a big challenge that has come with this whole idea of open access and the fact that now a lot of journals are online only, right? So you're no longer seeing a physical copy. And that has given rise to the predatory journals. The predatory journal, by definition, is a journal that will do, they claim to be open access. They'll take your paper, publish it, but they don't provide all the other services that you would typically expect from the fact that you're paying an open access fee. This includes the fact of getting appropriate review, peer review, production of the manuscript, and long-term curation and storage of the manuscript, right? So a lot of predatory journals, they'll take your open access field, they'll accept any paper that you submit regardless of the quality because they're charging the fees for that. They don't send it to real peer review, and then in a few months, the journal disappears. So there's no way for anybody to actually find your paper anymore. There are certain checklists. Dr. Moore at the University of Toronto have produced some work trying to help us identify predatory journals. One thing I typically ask or suggest to people who ask me this question is, well, have you ever heard of this journal before? Does the journal have a track record? How far does the story of the journal go? Is it supported by a publisher that you know about? Do you know anybody who has published there? And it's something that you can easily access. And if in doubt, always ask your friendly medical librarian to help you sort out this issue. There used to be some lists that were kept in terms of lists of predatory journals that were being constantly updated, but those had to be shut down. As far as I understand it, there were legal issues and so on in terms of how things on that list and so on. But I think that overall, if you've heard of it, if it's relevant, if it's known in your field, and if your librarian knows it, it's probably good. It's a good, legitimate open access journal. And there's a lot of very good, legitimate open access journals. I mentioned the two that we have in our family, but there's also all the other major journals have their own open access journal within their family. And there's some that are entirely like BMC or PLOS that are completely open access and legitimate journals.
What about impact factor? A lot of journals boast about their impact factor. I'm not sure how to interpret that number.
So impact factor is a very interesting thing. The impact factor was developed by medical librarians to try to identify what would be the journals they should be subscribing to. And what it does, it's a measure of the average citations to an average paper in the journal. So it doesn't tell you about specific papers. It tells you about, on average, the papers in this journal get cited so many times. It's calculated by the number of articles that were cited divided by the number of articles that were published. So publications with a large publication numbers that publish a lot of papers like neurology have a hard time bringing up their impact factor beyond a certain level. And similarly, very small journals with one or two very highly cited papers have a very high impact factor. It's been used as a measure, perhaps inappropriately as a measure of how good or how reputable a journal is, right? And we all say we don't care about journal impact factors, but we all know our journal impact factor. We used to know it through 3 decimal digits. Now they changed the system and there's only 1 decimal point, which makes a lot more sense. This is more important, for example, for authors when deciding when to submit papers. I know that in some countries, particularly in Europe, the impact factor of the journal where you publish has an impact on your promotion decisions. But I would say what's more important, even more than the impact factor, is to say, well, is this the journal that fits the scope of my paper? And is this the journal that reaches the audience that I want to reach when I write my paper? Now, there are some papers, for example, that are very influential. The impact factor just captures citations. So there's some papers that are very influential that may not get cited very often. So there may be papers that change clinical practice. If you read a paper that tells you, oh, maybe I should be changing how I change my patients with myasthenia based on this paper, that may not get cited. It's a very clinically focused paper, but it's probably more impactful than one that gets cited very much in some respect, right? Or they make it to public policy decisions and so on. So I think it's important to look more at the audience and the journal scope when you submit your papers to it.
One other technical question. The journals will also say they're indexed in PubMed or Google Scholar. Where, if I want to publish my paper and I want it indexed where the right people are going to find it, where does it need to be indexed?
Well, I grew up with Index Medicus, and I grew up with Medline and the Library of Science, and I still do. If I need to find something, I go to PubMed, right? So I like papers that are listed in Medline or that can be found in PubMed. I mean, they're not the same thing, but you can find them through them. So that would be an important thing. Nowadays, a lot more people are using Google Scholar or Google just to identify papers. So it may be a little bit less relevant, but it's still a measure of the quality of the journal before they get indexed in some of this. Like, for example, if it gets published, listed in Medline, it has gone through certain quality checks by the index itself to see if they would accept the journal or not. So that's something you want to make sure. And then typically most of the large journals or the journals you and I know about are listed in more than one place, right? They're listed in Scopus, in Web of Science, they're listed in Medline, and so on. And again, it has to do, if you're submitting your paper, go somewhere where you know the journal and you've heard about it.
I'm not going to ask you about AI. Okay, we can do that another time. So, but I want to ask something more kind of close to me is this question of publish or perish. There seems to be in academics more emphasis on the number of journals that one has published rather than their quality. How does a younger academician or one who really needs to publish, how do they cope with that?
A lot of people are writing up research that may not be relevant or that may not be high quality just because you need to have a long list of papers to get promoted. For example, if you're an academician, right? Doug Altman, who was a very influential person in the field of not only medical statistics, but also medical publishing. I mean, his idea was we need less research, but we need better research. We often get papers where you say, well, what's the rationale behind the question in this paper? It's just you had a lot of data and you can trying to squeeze as much as you can out of that. I think as a young academician, the important thing to think about is it an important question that matters to you and to the field from whatever perspective, because it's going to advance the research, it's going to advance the clinical care, public policy implications. And then is this one where the answer will be important no matter what the answer is? So if you're thinking of that, your work will be well recognized, people will know you. You'll get invited to collaborate. And I think that that's the most important thing, rather than just saying, let me just churn out a lot of papers. The productivity will come from the fact that you start by saying, let me ask something that's really meaningful to me and to the field with a good question and using a good, strong research methodology.
Thanks for that, Dr. Merino. I think that's very valuable for all of us. Well, this has been a great discussion. Do you have any final comments before we wrap up?
Well, no, I want to encourage people to continue reading medical journals all the time, submitting to us. Again, good research and important question with a robust methodology. That's what we're looking for in neurology and most serious medical journals.
Dr. Jose Merino, thanks for sharing your experience and insights with our audience. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner, reporting for Medscape.